Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Welcome to the Project Ihya podcast. We're back today with Dr. Arya, and we're going to be continuing with episode 2 of the series. The floor is all yours, Dr. Arya.
Walaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's an honor to be here, and I'm very happy to continue on with our conversation about the trajectory of the global reform of Islamic education. So last episode, in episode 1, we were talking about liberalism and liberal ideology and how it relates to colonialism, and how there was kind of a global religious reform project that was sponsored by the colonial empires, and how that transformed people's understanding of religion, and how it transformed educational institutions across the world, including Islamic educational institutions. But in that first episode, we kept things quite general. Now we're going to take a closer look at how these Islamic educational institutions, schools, and universities are transformed. Now, in order to understand how they are transformed, we have to understand what they looked like in the pre-modern period. So pre-Enlightenment, pre-1700, pre-1800, what does Islamic learning look like? And only once we appreciate that will we be able to grasp the transformations, the extent of the transformations that have occurred over the past 2 centuries or so. So let's begin by looking at pre-modern Islamic educational institutions across the Muslim world. In this period, in this pre-modern period, the way that people, if you want to become a religious scholar, the way that you begin your studies is you go to a basic religious school called a maktab or a kutab. And this school is a school that you will begin maybe as soon as you are ready, as soon as you're capable of sitting and learning. Maybe it can start even as early as 6 or 7. But at this school, you are taught to memorize the Quran. You are taught basic Arabic language skills, like, for instance, how to read the Arabic script, how to pronounce Arabic words, a certain amount of Arabic vocabulary. And also in these elementary schools, these elementary Islamic schools, you learn other basic aspects about the Islamic religion. So, for instance, basic beliefs about God and angels and heaven and hell, how to pray, how to fast, those kind of basic norms, how to dress appropriately. Now, you stay in this kutab or maktab. Your primary goal is to memorize the Quran. So you leave when the Quran is memorized. And ordinarily, people complete that when they are in their early teens. So around puberty, that's when they might finish memorizing the Quran. So maybe around 11, 12, 13. Yeah, are there people who finish earlier? There are. And in fact, one way in which traditional Islamic education is different than modern Western education is it's not linked to specific ages, in the sense that you don't say, okay, you're age 10 and you're in grade 5, or you're age 11 and you're in grade 6. Rather, the grade that you're in, what you're studying, really depends on on just completing things. So when you've completed your memorization of the Quran, whether it's a little bit earlier or a little bit later, you move on. And that depends on your level of maturity, your intelligence, the support of your family, and so on. But frequently people will complete their time at the kutab, memorizing the Quran, when they're their early teens. And if they want to become a religious scholar, they will go to a religious institution called a madrasa. Now, sometimes people will describe a madrasa as a college, but this is incorrect. what it is more is it is a type of it would be more accurate to say that it's kind of like a mixture of a high school and a college and a university. uh, at this time in the pre-modern Muslim world, people after they hit puberty, so after they've completed their studies at the kutab, they could be 14, 15 years old, and they will go to a madrasa and sit with much older students, people who are 20, 25, even much older students, 40. There isn't the same notion of age grades that they are in Western style learning. All of these people can learn together in the same madrasa. So a madrasa, yes, it offers the advanced learning that we would associate with a college or a university, a place that you would go after you're 18 years old. But historically, the madrasa also includes people at earlier ages as well. Now, what is a madrasa? What does a madrasa look like physically? It is a building where Islamic scholars or sheikhs or ulama regularly teach. It's often a mosque, although it doesn't have to be a mosque. The difference between a madrasa and a mosque is you can have many mosques where where you don't have scholars that regularly teach. Most mosques don't have scholars who regularly teach. Most mosques are just places where you go to pray. But a madrasa is a place where you have scholars regularly teach, and ordinarily they teach by having study circle lessons or halaqas that are scheduled around the 5 daily prayers. So they might give a lesson after Fajr or before Dhuhr or after Maghrib. It's kind of, they're scheduled around the 5 daily prayers. They're called study circles because traditionally a scholar sits on a chair or on a cushion, and then the students sit around him in a circle. Beyond having scholars who teach and kind of an open space for students to sit, a typical madrasa has a place for prayer, even if it's not a mosque itself. It typically has student accommodations, meaning some kind of housing for students, kind of rooms that they can go back to. It also traditionally has a book collection or library, which is quite important in the era before print because books are very rare and expensive commodities that can be very difficult to get your hands on. So these are characteristics of madrasas.
One
Madrasas are
question,
very
one question regarding the terms. Before the pre-modern period was, for example, kutab or makatib, right? Were these pretty widespread all over the Muslim world? Like, for example, I have Somali friends who would call like a hifz madrasa. They would call it like I think duksi, for example. So there's like, were these words like pretty widespread? And like the word madrasa, was it used like if you go to India, yes, it's used that way. But for example, let's say you go to Morocco, let's say you go to like Saudi Arabia, like or before the modern era. So in that time, like, were the same words used in these across the Muslim world?
The same, I mean, variations of the same words were often used. So the institutions spread across the entire Muslim world. And one of the reasons why they spread across the entire Muslim world is these are not, as we will see, large institutions like universities. To build a university, you need millions of dollars. It's like a giant project. You have thousands of students, tons of buildings, tons of labs. A madrasa, as we'll see, can be quite a small institution, and scholars traveling across all 5 regions of the Muslim world, namely Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. Scholars in all of these regions established madrasas. In certain cases, in the Arab world, they usually called them madrasas. In other places, like in Turkey, they would call them like midrasas. Like it's like a version. I know my Turkish pronunciation is bad, but you can see it looks like medresi
Yeah.
if you
Yes.
see it written out. In South Asia, they would call them pondok or pasantren. That doesn't sound like madrasa at all. So, in certain cases, you have them giving them names that don't sound like the Arabic at all. But the institution is widespread, and commonly they are called madrasas.
Okay.
These madrasas, if we compare them to universities today, they're very small institutions. When you talk about a small madrasa, it might have less than 50 students. When you talk about larger madrasas, they might have hundreds of students. But we're not talking about a typical madrasa doesn't have 1,000 students, 1,000 students, 2,000 students, let alone like 10 or 50,000 students. One of the reasons for that is the students in a madrasa are supposed to have very close personal relations with their instructors, and this becomes highly problematic if you have large bureaucratic institutions. You lose the personal relations element to madrasa learning. So who's paying for these madrasas? Yeah, you can have people give donations, but ordinarily what you have are endowments that are called waqfs. A waqf will be maybe a piece of farmland or a piece of real estate, like could be a hotel, could be a place, could be a store, and rent from this land or rent from the real estate will be used to fund the upkeep of the madrasa, like to make sure to repair it, to provide new lights, to provide new books, and then also to provide stipends for the instructors, so for the teachers there and also for the students, because a teacher cannot spend his time teaching if he's engaged in commercial activity or traveling. Now, of course, they, as a matter of fact, will blend those things to some extent. But the more you teach, or if you want to seriously learn all the time, it very much facilitates that if you have some kind of financial support. And the endowments that are associated, usually when someone establishes a madrasa, they also set aside agricultural land or real estate, and they use rent from that to fund these stipends. In the pre-modern period, madrasas are overwhelmingly focused on religious subjects like Quran, fiqh, aqidah, or kalam, and the study of the Arabic language, which is needed to understand the key religious texts. Are there non-religious subjects that are taught? Yes, mathematics, logic, astronomy, but they receive very limited attention. And oftentimes they're only studied insofar as they aid religious understanding. So, for instance, math might be useful in dividing up inheritance shares. Logic might be helpful in solving certain legal problems or theological problems. Astronomy might be useful if you're trying to go ahead and do a moon sighting and determining, when a particular month like Ramadan begins or ends. The madrasa learning that you have is open-ended in the sense that you don't get a degree when you're 18 or 22. You can go ahead and learn at a madrasa as long as you have something to learn, as long as you're getting some kind of benefit. And then later on, you might even become a teacher at the same madrasa.
I think
And you could be learning and a teacher at the same time.
When it comes to the religious subjects and the non-religious subjects that are taught in the madrasa, I think one thing to keep in mind is that the idea of the religious and secular, this is something that came about much later. Like these are more like invented terms. Classically, the way sciences were studied, especially Islamically, is everything was kind of posited through an Islamic framework. Like these dichotomies between the religious subjects versus secular subjects, or the idea of the secular itself is not something that really existed, right? So even something like mathematics, logic, astronomy, you're right, even we can say anatomy, right? Like, so aspects of medicine, these were all things that were studied, and they did receive attention insofar as they aided religious understanding. But the reason for that is because, how shall I say, like, how can I explain? In today's terms, we understand the world through its like physical and like maybe chemical properties, and from there we have like the various sciences and the various kind of subjects that we study, right? But classically, part of the metaphysical world that existed, part of the ontology, was were the things that we believed in Islamically. So angels were included in there, the truth of revelation is something that was kind of presupposed, and so on and so forth. These were axiomatic. So from that sense, like astronomy or even biology was studied, but incorporating everything that existed in the world, including aspects of revelation. So everything was kind of studied from an Islamic lens. So this is why also we see in books of grammar or in books of logic, and even like Avicennan books, right? Like Ibn Sina, you look at the Falasifa, the examples that they would use, many times would be examples from the Quran. They would make allusions to, XYZ stories of the prophets. And the reason for this is because this, dichotomization between, the religious and the secular was not something that, I think that's something that was imported more from, Christianity as, the colonial hegemony became a much more real thing. Some of those, some of the baggage that they underwent kind of
Could you
maybe
say it was because of a strengthening of the materialistic thought frame? Like as materialism sort of solidified into a, as it got bigger, this dichotomy starts to become clear, and those start falling into the materialistic.
So here's something like some food for thought, and I want to ask Dr. Arya about this. We do see, like even classically, that it is true that the interest in something like astronomy or even something like logic stemmed from a religious root or from a religious background. But then we see that there are entire like independent treatises that are written, on atomism, on different issues of metaphysics, different issues of astronomy. It seemed like these sciences ended up developing as independent sciences eventually, and even then it would still take a kind of they would use religious examples and so on and so forth. But what are your thoughts on this, Dr. Arya?
These are some very good points, some very insightful points. And to some extent, the presentation that I'm going to give is structured to address these points. So temporarily at this, you have correctly noted that there are questions about using terms like religious subjects and non-religious subjects, because clearly the term non-religious subjects conjures up or suggests the notion of secularity. And we have to be very careful about thinking about a religious, secular division in these pre-modern Muslim societies. And I agree that the way that people in these societies think is not in terms of religious or non-religious or religious and secular. I have it temporarily here as a placeholder. What I'm going to talk about a little bit later on is not subjects taught at a madrasa, split up in terms of religious and non-religious, but rather in terms of like indigenous concepts like ulum al-naqliya and ulum al-aqliya. But before getting into that, I'm going to try and introduce the epistemic framework. So this is just kind of like a preliminary introduction so that someone kind of knows what we're talking about when we talk about madrasa and madrasa curriculum. But later on, I'm going to try and be a little bit more precise. And after I try and lay out things in a bit of a more precise way that's sensitive to the terms that are actually used by pre-modern scholars, I think at that point it would be good to circle back and ask to what extent terms like secular are useful, or how are they not useful? How do they misguide us? How do they not really accurately capture the thought patterns that are characteristic of the pre-modern madrasa? So my response is just great point, but just give me a second, and then inshallah we'll come back to it. I would argue that when it comes to the structure of the pre-modern madrasa, it really reflects a pre-modern Islamic epistemology. Epistemology is an understanding of knowledge. What are the sources of valid knowledge? And I would say that when it comes to pre-modern Islamic epistemology, there are three basic sources of knowledge: naql, aql, and ma'rifah. You can make it more elaborate, like I'm very sympathetic to people like who maybe are partial to Ibn Taymiyyah and would add in fitra and other things as well. That's fine. I'm not opposing the existence of more complex schemas.
Would you mind translating naql, aql, and ma'rifah?
I will. These are actually in the coming slides.
Okay.
So they're terms that you have to, I think, if you really want to appreciate the link between these terms in the madrasa, you have to be a little bit careful with the translation. So I am going to do that right now. So let's start with naql. Naql as a source of knowledge. What do we mean when we're talking about naql as a source of knowledge? I would say that naql consists in a transmitted religious tradition. Naql literally means transmission. And this tradition, this Islamic tradition, is understood as centering on divinely revealed scriptural texts, hadith, Quran, but is not limited to them. So you can transmit religious knowledge in the form of commentaries or treatises, fiqh texts, aqidah texts as well. Also, in a moment, I will explain that you can transmit religious tradition also through embodied behavior, like, for instance, learning how to pray by watching your sheikh pray. But overall, we're talking about a transmitted religious tradition, and that at its core is understood to be these divinely revealed scriptural texts. And these scriptural texts tell us lots of things about the world, about the universe, and about morality that otherwise we could not know. We could not know independently based on our reason, based on our independent thinking. So, for instance, we could not know, if it were not for these divinely revealed texts, that angels punish sinners in the grave, because this is a matter of the ghaib. We can't see it with our eyes. We could not know that at some historical point in time, Prophet Moses transformed his stick into a snake. This is not something for which there is archaeological evidence that we could use to establish such a thing. And in fact, the act itself appears to be an exception to the ordinary laws that govern the physical universe. Not only do these divine texts tell us things about the world that otherwise we could not know for ourselves, these texts tells things about morality that otherwise we could not know for ourselves. So how would we know that it's morally good to fast Ramadan, that it's praiseworthy to fast Ramadan, if this was not revealed to us by scriptural texts? How do we know that it's good to pray 5 times a day as opposed to 4 times a day? How do we know that it's good to punish a slander or someone engaged in qadh with exactly 80 lashes? This is something that depends on scriptural texts. Aql alone, reason alone, is not something that could tell us these things. Okay, aql is best contrasted with naql. And oftentimes when people will talk about Islamic epistemology, they will only talk about these things, aql versus naql. Aql can be thought of as reason, but reason understood in a specific way. It's an innate capacity that human beings have, which enable them. It enables a person to reach many truths independently, without depending on anyone else. So aql can tell us things that we can know, things about the world, and maybe even things about morality without depending on scripture from a prophet. Like, we can know things about the world. We can know that, for instance, animals give birth to other animals. We can know that, for instance, when the sun comes up, the world gets hotter. These are things that we can know without depending on scripture. So this is a form of knowledge that human beings can use to independently know things without depending on scripture. So reason has many different components. Some of them are intuitions about logical or mathematical or moral principles. So, for instance, rationally, we just feel that it's compelling, that the law of contradiction is valid. So no one can say that both there's an elephant in this room and there's not an elephant in this room at the same time. It doesn't make sense. These are contradictory statements. This is something that we know on the basis of reason. There's a rational intuition. We know that the whole is greater than the part. More controversially, certain scholars, whether they be Falasifa, Mu'tazila, Maturidis, will say that we even have certain moral principles that are rational in nature. So if we think about it, we can say it's bad to lie. It's bad to harm people for no reason. If someone does something good to us, we have an obligation to do something good back to them. Shukr al-mun'im, reciprocity. These are things that we can know. These are things that automatically make sense as morally good or morally bad. Anyone who thinks about it, if I told you it's morally wrong to wear a yellow hat on Wednesday, you would say, why? It doesn't make any sense. If I said it's morally wrong to harm someone without a reason, it's morally wrong to engage in incest, it's morally wrong to lie, you'd say, okay, that makes some kind of sense. Why? Because you're using your rational faculty. Reason also tells us that, generally speaking, you have an intuition. It makes sense to you to trust your empirical observation. So your hiss, your reason tells you that if you see a table in front of you, a table is in front of you. Now, that's not, obviously there are exceptions. It could be a dream, it could be a hallucination, you could be in the Matrix. But, generally speaking, you have an intuition that you can trust, your empirical observation. So reason as a source of knowledge becomes the foundation for various disciplines involving empirical observation. So astronomy, medicine, optics, zoology. Among pre-modern Muslims, they use the term falsafa or philosophy to refer to all of the different disciplines, all of the different ulum that are based on reason alone. So, for instance, reason tells us certain things about mathematics. It tells us certain things about logic. It tells us to trust our sense perception. So when my sense perception tells me certain things about the stars based on astronomical observation, it tells me certain things about animals, like, for instance, snakes have venom that can kill you. All of this is seen as philosophy, falsafa. And the Greek thinkers are credited and praised for really taking a leading role in developing reason-based philosophical knowledge. And one of the major things that happens between the 8th and the 10th centuries is there is a translation movement associated with the Abbasids and the Darul Hikmah, where they are translating a lot of Greek treatises as well as certain Persian and Indian treatises, forms of knowledge, into the Arabic language, because they say we can benefit from the rational knowledge that is found in these texts. Okay, so we have aql, we have naql, we have aql. Now finally we come to ma'rifa. So ma'rifa is also understood in the pre-modern period as being a source of knowledge. So ma'rifa is a type of direct experiential knowledge of supernatural matters, like the existence of God or hell. These things are seen as, these things are understood as being part of an unseen realm or ghaib. But despite the fact that they're not seen, that they're not accessible to ordinary empirical observation, there are still ways to see them, just not with your ordinary eyes. There are ways to see them. So one of the most important forms of ma'rifa is the supernatural vision, or the ru'ya, which can be seen in a sleeping or a waking state. So in a dream or even in a waking state, you might see angels or hell or dead saints, dead awliya or dead prophets or God's throne. This is something that you could see in a vision. Now, people will say, of course, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam saw these different things in visions. When people talk about ma'rifa, they're saying that ordinary or pious people after the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam can have a somewhat similar experience. Now, this doesn't make them prophets, but that they do have, under certain circumstances, the ability to perceive certain amount of supernatural phenomenon. Sometimes this is referred to as ilham or kashf, or ru'ya. Now, so visions are one type of ma'rifa. Another type of ma'rifa is the felt experience of directly encountering God and being absorbed into God's oneness while feeling oneself disappear and feeling all things in the world disappear. This is referred to as fana, or self-annihilation. Although Muslim scholars who talk about this will say, okay, maybe you feel like you're disappearing and being absorbed into God, but there's always a distinction between you and God, even though you might not experience it. So they are, most scholars, I don't want to say all of them, but most scholars want to avoid any kind of notion of ittihad or union with God, although you do have a minority of Sufi scholars claiming that some kind of unity is possible, but this is widely seen as heretical. When people talk about the type of information that you get through Ma'rifah, they will mention various different things. So, for instance, you can come to understand more about angels if you see angels. You can understand more about hell if you see them yourself. You can see, how many, can see things about their wings, how they talk, what kind of torments people are going under and undergoing in hell if you see visions of angels in hell. You could also encounter a dead prophet like the Prophet Muhammad SAW, and he could give you a book. So Ibn Arabi says that his famous text Fusus al-Hikam was given to him by the Prophet SAW in a vision. I'm not endorsing all of this, by the way. I'm not. We're talking about general Islamic intellectual history. These are some of the Ibn Arabi is obviously a highly controversial figure. But whether one goes as far as Ibn Arabi, the notion that you could have visions of the Prophet ﷺ or other prophets is widespread. You could also come to know the true nature of God by encountering him in one of these fana type experiences. One of the other things that one gets from directly seeing things and directly encountering them is certainty that they exist. So you get a type of yaqeen. Beyond that, you get a deeper understanding that only comes with direct experience as opposed to verbal knowledge. So for instance, imagine that you have a blind person and you're trying to explain yellow, the concept of yellow to them. You try and explain it in words, but ultimately someone cannot understand the reality of yellow until they see yellow. Similarly, you can read the Quran. The Quran can mention angels and God and everything else, but maybe they're mere words to you unless you see it, unless you. I should also say that the fanat type experience is something which recurs across different religious traditions and has been studied scientifically. And it does have certain very interesting features, including what is often called more real than real, meaning that when people have this experience, and there's a similar experience in Christianity and Buddhism and Hinduism, maybe in Buddhism it's called nirvana, in Hinduism it's being absorbed into Brahman. When people have this experience, they say it's like waking up from a dream. Like if you were in a dream right now and then you woke up, you would say, okay, maybe I was dreaming that I was in Mecca. But I woke up and I found, no, I'm not in Mecca, I'm in the United States. And that was just a dream. This is a higher level of reality. Now, when people undergo this experience of fana and they feel everything vanish except for the oneness of the universe or the oneness of God, they feel that this is a deeper reality than their ordinary sense perception. And even after the experience is over, they say this is the deepest reality. Most of them say that this is the deepest reality, that the ordinary sensory world is like an illusion, like the Hindus refer to it as Maya, but people will call it like a lesser level of reality, that the highest, so Muslim scholars will say that the haqiqah, that the haqq is God. This is the highest level of reality, and everything else is lower. And this is one of the reasons why people are very interested in Sufi or Sufi learning. They'll say this is how you can attain the deepest level of certainty. Maybe like you're Ghazali, you're experiencing some doubts, you're experiencing some uncertainty, and then you go ahead and resolve that uncertainty by walking the Sufi path. This is like his spiritual autobiography, Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, is where he talks about these issues. So acquiring ma'rifa honestly is not that easy. Most people don't find it easy at all to have a fanat type experience or to have a vision. Really, in order for people, all of these different religions, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, there are people who seek visions and who seek this fanat type experience, and it always involves a intense spiritual training program with certain shared features. And the reason why it's central to all of these religions is because people say, what causes you to be a non-religious person or not to focus on religion or not to appreciate the value of religion is that you think that the deepest reality is the empirical world, what you see. That's hard for you to get away from. In reality, you have to have belief. You have to have iman, that there's a Jannah, that there's a nar, that there's Allah. For the ordinary believer, it's not like you see it before your eyes. Yeah, maybe the believer with the highest level of yaqeen, the highest level of iman, it's like he sees it before his very eyes. Unfortunately, most of us are not on that level. But they say after you undergo this experience, you do see it with your own eyes. And for that level, you reach the highest level of piety and belief. But you can't just but it takes a lot to have that kind of experience. And to recognize that this world is an illusion, that it's not the deepest truth, that the deepest reality is this other ghaib reality of God. So you need to train the body, you need to train the mind. Asceticism is part of these programs in a Muslim context where they have like a sheikh who's running a Sufi tariqah and guiding his different murids. So sometimes there's asceticism, which can be denial of food, denial of drink, denial of sleep, loneliness, like spending time alone. It can involve chanting or singing, which means dhikr or Quran recitation or poetry recitation. It can mean the use of musical instruments like the drum, or wind instruments like the ney or the reed flute, or string instruments like the oud or sitar. You find this among Sufi tariqas like Qadriya, Mawlawiyya, Chishtiya. Can involve synchronized bodily movements like the whirling of the Mawlawiyya or the throwing of one's upper body back and forth that one finds among the Rifa'iyya. It can also involve the use of wine and narcotics like the Bektashi. Now let me go ahead and state something very clearly. Sufi groups exist on a continuum. There are some Sufis that are Sharia observant, considered orthodox Sufis. They're called sober Sufis. Their Sufism is oriented by sobriety or sahu, and their ideal is Junaid. There are also drunken Sufis. Their ideal is intoxication, drunkenness. Their ideal is like al-halaj. Okay? When you start talking about using wine,
do you mean a literal drunkenness or just like a state of when you say their ideal is drunkenness, do you just mean a state of like absorption into, or do you mean like an actual drunkenness?
We're talking about it as a historical phenomenon. Historical. I'm not saying this is orthodox. Once again, I'm saying it's not orthodox. It's not orthodox.
No, I understand. All I'm asking is when you say like their ideal is drunkenness, do you mean like historically? Like, are you saying literal
historically? Some literally drank wine. Okay. They literally
they use narcotics.
They literally did hashish. Like this was like a big issue. Okay. Because
I think even nowadays there's a big movement towards spiritualism through these mind-altering drugs and stuff.
Might work good in America.
The Orthodox Sharia observant Muslim scholars had big problems with many of these Sufi groups. Bektashis, Haidaris, Abdals, Qalandars. You also talk about certain. These are groups that say you don't need to observe the Sharia. They're groups that say you don't need to observe the Sharia. Well, I mean, what's shocking if you say, oh, the Bektashiya drink alcohol, you would say, well, that's against the Sharia. They say things like suqut takalif. They say sometimes the aim of the Sharia is to give you ma'rifah. But if it becomes an obstacle, leave the Sharia. Or once you've attained the ma'rifah, you can leave the Sharia. So I do not want to say that these are orthodox Sharia groups. Even when
And
we talk about things like wind instruments, even when we talk about the oud or the sitar, like these musical instruments, there are major debates. You have Sufi groups like Naqshbandis, they don't like musical instruments. They prefer like a silent dhikr. There's a spectrum in terms of Sufis that are the sober Sufis that are really following the Sharia, and the ones that are not following the Sharia. And in reality, there are a lot of people in the middle. But the major point is this: all of these are mechanisms. All of these are techniques to attain ma'rifah. Just the sober Sufis, the Sharia compliant Sufis said, yeah, maybe you can attain this experience, but it's not acceptable to do it through non-Sharia means. They said you need to attain the ma'rifah through Sharia means.
So then is ma'rifah not more of an objective as opposed to like aql and naql, which are basically seen as tools?
I would say that, I mean, you could say that ma'rifah, if you compare ma'rifah to ilm, you could say it's the objective. But what I would say is it's a type of knowledge. Like basically, when we're talking about ma'rifah, we're saying that there's a type of experience, a mystic experience that you could have that would give you all different types of knowledge. Like it would give you knowledge of what angels are like or what hell is like, or it would give you a level of certainty. And those are seen as types of knowledge that otherwise you wouldn't have. And, theoretically, if you believe people like Ibn Arabi, you could have a dream where the Prophet ﷺ appears to you and gives you a book and says, okay, transmit this. Like that would be possible as well. And in that book is written lots of what he would consider to be knowledge, like different tafsirs and so forth.
One question.
I guess it's kind of a lot of it is there's a subjective element to it, and I guess that's why there's a lot of there's such a big spectrum of how people kind of get into ma'rifah. I mean, you're talking about from really from Plato's time, where he's talking about the world of forms and then the truth, and how you achieve it through philosophizing and there's a sense of that in it, and I guess that's why you see such a big spectrum of approaches to it, of attaining it.
I mean, there are very different attitudes toward, because if you say ma'rifah is the only goal, that the Sharia is simply a tool to the achievement of ma'rifah, it suggests that you can get rid of the Sharia if there are other ways of getting the ma'rifah. But the Orthodox Muslims have always said that no, you can only go after ma'rifah in the context of the Sharia. And if you leave aside the Sharia, then what you think is ma'rifah or experiential knowledge, it's coming from the devil. It's not legitimate.
Is there a distinction maybe between between a sort of what's the word, a sort of ma'rifah that happens without you trying for it, versus a sort of ma'rifah where you're creating conditions, right? So that happens for you. So, for example, you could have a person, like you could have a Hindu, you could have people of different religions, and they could create such conditions and put themselves in a psychological state where they do, get some sort of, experience. Now, does that lead to certain knowledge? Like, for example, rationally, 2 + 2. It doesn't matter how you cut the, slice the pie. Every two people are going to come to the same conclusion, right? So aql, it's like uniform. And same thing for like empiricism. Like if I touch an elephant, you touch an elephant, we should feel the same thing, like unless you have some, exceptions, but 99% of the time you're going to feel the same thing. Now, when it comes to, ma'rifah, because of the ability to curate an environment, you can have it be more likely, especially since you said like this kind of concept of fana and mysticism is shared across religions, right? So it does mean, like, just the discipline existing does mean that you do have different groups of people reaching that end result, right? In different religions.
Well, I mean, all these people are getting to a result of experience, but what they're experiencing may not always necessarily be the truth or what's right.
But isn't
well,
that
there are a couple of different responses to this, but it's a great question. So the biggest criticism of Ma'rifa would be the following. It's just a subjective hallucination. You hallucinate one thing, another person hallucinates another. Here are a couple of responses to that. Once again, I'm not defending it. I'm just saying the kind of responses that have been given. Imagine that you say, okay, in terms of me seeing a specific thing like an angel, maybe that is subjective. But one of the things that is shared and that is correct across all of the different religions, whether it's Buddhism, Hinduism, or Islam, is that this world, this sensory world, is not the deepest level of reality. So that is actually true, and that's what I take away from my ma'rifah. That this is not the deeper level of reality, that there is some deeper level of reality. I maybe know part of it through ma'rifah, but the rest of it I need to be learned from the Quran or from naql to perfect my understanding of this additional reality. But the mere existence of another reality could be established through ma'rifah, just like many people would say the existence of some creator could be established by aql on the basis of argument from design or a cosmological argument. An additional point would be one that you find in people like Ibn Arabi. I don't want to keep mentioning Ibn Arabi. I know he's a controversial figure, but he has some very interesting ideas and some really very controversial, wild ideas. But one of the things he says is, you go ahead and you read the Quran, you read the Hadith, and it's not describing the ordinary empirical world. Like when you hear things about there's an angel with multiple faces and hundreds of wings, and there are rubies falling out of the wings, or there's like a tree in hell with like a devil's heads on it as fruit. It's not the ordinary empirical world. Someone like Ibn Arabi, someone like a Sufi would say, this sounds absolutely strange to someone who's never experienced it. And maybe you have some of the falasifa who are overly rational and they say it's a metaphor. They say maybe the Quran talks about an angel with 1,000 wings punishing someone or controlling the heavens, and they say it's a metaphor for God's power. But the Sufi says, I literally saw that yesterday. I saw it in my dream yesterday. This is like an actual, that is the experience that is being expressed in the Quran. It's not simply a metaphor. And beyond that, we see all kinds of interesting things that can happen in this ghaib realm. In the ghaib realm, like for instance, there is the hadith, and I'm just paraphrasing it, where the Prophet ﷺ says he has a vision and he was given a cup of milk and it was knowledge. And Ibn Arabi likes to talk about this hadith. And he says knowledge is not something physical, but in this vision, it was physical. And that's the thing about the ghaib for anyone who has experience with these, with this type of ma'rifah. If you have a vision, you can say, so an ordinary person will ask a question like, does God actually have a hand, or does God not have a hand? Is God above a throne or not above a throne? Is he a body or not a body? And people who have the experience of ma'rifah say you can have incorporeal entities like God or like knowledge take on physical forms. And the real issue is that God is a body and not a body in this context. That in this world, a cup of knowledge can both be milk and not be milk. But that's something that won't make sense to you if you've never understood the ghaib and you try and incorporate and you try and understand things in terms of just empirical experience and rationality. And a lot of these Sufis will say things like, if you haven't engaged in, if you don't understand ma'rifah, you cannot understand the zahir of the Quran. They will say the Quran is, even when the Quran is saying all of these things that are so distant from any kind of empirical experience, and even if it's saying things which appear to be contradictory or complex, like there's an embodiment of incorporeal entities or angels, they say, yeah, that makes no sense. You don't understand the Quran if you've never had this experience. But if you've had the experience, you know that it makes sense. And these people, These people are basically divided into two groups. They're the falasifa who try and interpret all of this language in the Quran in ways metaphorical. And then there are other people who they will dismiss as like the low-level jurists. Well, I'm not saying I agree with it, but I'm just saying you get this kind of language. They say the most that these people can do is simply say, I affirm what is in the Quran. It's like a blind person affirming the color of yellow. Yeah, I believe that there's yellow. I believe it. But there's a huge difference between you simply affirming it and actually seeing it and experiencing it in your own eyes. And the only way to truly understand the Quran, which is a record of prophetic visions, is to have those visions yourself. And as long as you haven't done that, don't pretend that you're at the same level of knowledge as one of these Sufis. Once again, I'm not saying they're right, but that's the kind of argument that they make when they're talking about ma'rifah and the importance of ma'rifah as a type of knowledge. They would say you cannot understand if you are obsessed with understanding the Quran and the Hadith and the zahir, the literal meaning of the Quran and Hadith. If you want to respect that, if you want to appreciate that, if you want to have yaqeen in that, you have to walk the Sufi path. That's what they would say.
That would mean that, even in terms of the interplay between aql and naql, you have a third variable, which is ma'rifah, and in your usul al-fiqh, you have ma'rifah playing a role now. So if you were like a purist, like usuli, you might reach one conclusion, but if you now are on the path of ma'rifah, and that could in theory contradict with what you might reach in just pure usuli terms. Is that right?
Yeah, so that's another piece of the puzzle. But one mistake is when people say ma'rifah, it doesn't mean that they reject the nusus. Some of them, they do reject the nusus. But for some of them, they say, I support ma'rifah because I want to actually understand the nusus. And you can only understand the nusus if you understand what they're talking about. Beyond that, another condition that people will take into account when they're talking about ma'rifah, they will say that your experience, your ru'ya, your fana, your ma'rifah generally is only valid, it's only trustworthy if it has been procured, if you experience it on the basis of the Sharia, like if you're a Sharia observant person. Otherwise, your heart is corrupt. So maybe, for instance, you will have a person and they will have uncertainty in a legal matter. And then after that, they will pray 2 rak'ah. So they'll say, what's the correct ijtihad with respect to this issue? And then after that, they will have some kind of ilham. The ilham could take the vision that they have. They could have some very impressive vision, like the Prophet ﷺ comes to them and says, this is the correct solution, or this is the answer to your question. Like maybe the Prophet ﷺ comes to Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari and says, follow the school of Ibn Hazm. Yeah, that can happen. But you could also have a situation where all of a sudden you just feel an inclination in your heart. Okay, this is the appropriate solution. And Ibn Taymiyyah, someone who respects the nusus as much as Ibn Taymiyyah, the zahir of the nusus of Ibn Taymiyyah, he says ilham is valid. It's valid when it comes to Sharia reasoning. You're not allowed to use the ilham to override the nusus. But if you read the Quran, you read the Hadith, you look at the ijma, and you're still uncertain about the appropriate solution, you can pray to God for guidance. And He can give it in the context of this kind of revelation, which is trustworthy if it's received by a pure heart.
What I was saying was not that ma'rifah could overrule the nusus, but it could. Here, it could, if somebody feels like they have reached, yaqeen through ma'rifah on a certain point, it could not override the nusus, but it could override a certain deduction where there's two possibilities from the nusus, right?
Yeah.
So let's say, which is exactly what you just said. You gave a clear example where, let's say there's two things, right? But let's say usulan, like if you were to follow a certain usuli process, and then one would be weightier, right, than the other, is just in theory. But let's say your ma'rifah lends more credence to the less weighty point, just usulan. You get what I'm saying? Like,
yeah, it's an interesting question. If you wanted to ask me, like my own personal opinion, which is probably irrelevant overall, I actually don't like ma'rifah overriding things because I think that it could be too subjective. So I would say
our teachers, a lot of our teachers,
if if there's complete equality, but I'm not speaking on behalf of Ibn Arabi or some of these other some of the big proponents of Ma'rifa. In fact, I would guess that many of the more drunken Sufis, many of the more sukr-oriented Sufis, in fact, love coming up with interpretations of the Quran that shock you. They shock you because they go so much against the zahir of the nas. So not only are they saying things like al-halaj and al-haq, I am God, Bayezid Bistami, Subhani. You have Ibn Arabi coming up with these interpretations of the Quran where, like, when the Pharaoh says, I'm your Lord, it's like fana, and he's saying something pious, and he's saved. Or you have Ahmed al-Ghazali, not Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. When we say Ghazali, we mean Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. This is Ahmed al-Ghazali, the brother of Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. He said, if you want to understand Tawheed, you have to learn it from the devil. Why? Because the devil said he's not going to prostrate for anyone else. He will only prostrate to God. He will not prostrate to humankind. And God said, well, I'm going to put you in hell for that. You're the devil, and I'm going to put you in hell. And he said, I only act for love of you. I don't act for heaven or hell. I only act out of my pure love for you. So there's this idea that the devil, there's a claim which is ascribed to him. I'm not saying this is correct, but there's a very provocative claim or quote that's ascribed to Ahmed al-Ghazali. Check it yourself. But it's alleged that he said, he who does not learn Tawheed from Shaitan is like a kafir. So they say these things that are meant to be very shocking and provocative. They do it intentionally. And the way that relates to your point is as follows. They come up with tafsir or ta'wil of the nusus that appears to go completely against it. And that indicates that they are using their ma'rifah as an excuse to go against, to come up with a opinion that would otherwise be a very shaky, questionable, even outrageous opinion. Obviously, Ibn Taymiyyah doesn't like that, and I find him compelling on that point.
Yeah, I just want you mentioned we said a lot about ma'rifah here. There is a valid usage of ma'rifah even within all the traditional schools, but it's on the premise that sharia then tariqah, what they'll call it tariqah, ma'rifah. So they say that there's no tariqah without sharia. So there's a valid use of it, and the objective of ma'rifah to achieve ma'rifah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Matter of fact, there's a big emphasis on that in a lot of the schools. And then you have sort of these extreme strands which kind of flip the table and make ma'rifah sort of the essential when it's actually something that comes after the steps of sharia, and sunnah and all of that.
Dr. Arya, would wahi be something which would be considered ma'rifah? Or
that was actually the question. We had aql, naql. I was saying the third one should have been, or at least we've heard it.
Could also be wahi. Could also be naql from Allah.
The issue here is they would say, Sufis would say ma'rifah is similar to wahi, but they don't want to say that the prophets, they don't want to say that the awliya are the same as the prophets. So they kind of like downgrade it. They would say there are similarities. There are similarities between wahi and ma'rifah. And I would think that maybe some of them would even say that it could be a type of wahi, but ordinarily they're careful about maintaining the differences between the anbiya and the awliya, and they don't want to say that they're receiving some kind of divine revelation of the type that a prophet would receive. It's just like they don't say that
I actually meant it in the other way, like not is wahi, is ma'rifah a type of wahi, but is wahi a type of ma'rifah, in that if somebody removes wahi or a ma'rifah from their epistemology, then they're necessarily dropping wahi with it.
It's an interesting question. I want to be careful, and one of the problems is there are all these very interesting theories of when you talk about the prophets. Like if you talk about Ibn Arabi, if you talk about Ahmed Sirhindi and how they're describing the prophets. Some of them are describing the prophets as awliya, like they're a wali and a prophet at the same time. And some of the knowledge, they will say like, yeah, some of the knowledge that they're getting about God is actually Marifa type knowledge that they're getting as a wali. They will say, for instance, the Prophet Muhammad SAW is a wali, and some will even go so far as saying that his wilaya is more important than his prophethood. And what prophethood is about is it's about giving a message to the masses. Like, but you could be given certain types of inspiration or marifa, and they would be binding on you as an individual, but not the masses. But I just want to be very careful in what I'm saying here, because this can get very I don't want
People might
to.
misunderstand.
This is already getting pretty getting
Yeah.
into like a pretty sensitive area to begin with.
Yeah, and also this is
I'll
like
think-
a
I'll
minor
think about
point, and this is also a minor point. We're kind of getting into the too much into the trees here. So
Yeah, so let's just move forward, inshallah.
Okay. So although pre-modern Muslim thinkers generally agree that naql and aql and ma'rif are three sources of knowledge, they differ in their comparative status, which is important in cases of apparent contradiction or ta'arud. How do you elevate them? So, for instance, with respect to Orthodox Muslim thinkers in matters of fiqh or aqidah or tasawwuf, generally they give naql precedence. And this tendency is the strongest among Ahlul Hadith, but it's also found in a lesser form among Asharites, Maturidites, sober Sufis, and so on. So, for instance, if someone said, on the basis of my aql, people don't have a body after they die. I saw dead bodies and the bodies rot away. If there's some life after death, it's purely a matter of the ruh. It doesn't involve the body. This was, in fact, a common view among the philosophers, and it was criticized as kufr by Al-Ghazali in Tahafut al-Falasifa. Why? Because he said the nusus say that there's a bodily resurrection. So this is clear kufr, and Al-Ghazali wasn't someone who was easy in making takfir on people, as is evident in Faiz al-Tafriqa. Also, you will have people on the basis of aql saying, no, we deny these miracles, we deny these mu'jizat, but the Orthodox Muslim thinkers will say, no, yeah, we agree that mu'jizat differ from what you would know about the world based on aql and sense perception. But we affirm their existence despite the fact that they conflict with aql or could be seen as conflicting with aql. And also if someone comes and they say on the basis of ma'rifah, for instance, I saw a prophet or I saw an angel and that angel said to me, now you can drink khamar, the Orthodox Muslim thinkers would say, okay, that's a case of ta'arud. The Quran says khamr is forbidden, and you had this vision where an angel appeared to you and said, okay, drink khamr. You need to go ahead, and in this case of ta'arud, you need to elevate the nusus. You need to elevate naql over this ma'rif, over this experience that you had. Now, when you talk about aql, the Muslim philosophers, the falasifa, like Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, Ibn Tufayl, all of them say aql is to be given priority over naql and over the nusus. So when they see a contradiction between aql, like for instance, if they say that the nusus say that after you die, human beings live eternally in heaven with a resurrected body, the philosophers will deny that. They'll simply say that's a metaphor. They'll produce some kind of ta'wil. So the Muslim philosophers actually acknowledge a place for naql. They don't deny it as a source of knowledge, but they say in cases of ta'arud, we make taqdeem of aql. We make taqdeem of aql over naql. When you talk about drunken Sufis, like the Sufis of Sukr, they will give priority to their ma'rifah over the nusus. And generally speaking, within Sufism, they elevate the status of ma'rifah even if they don't go this far. So so when we talk about Islam, we're talking about a tripartite epistemology where we conceptualize aql and naql and ma'rifah as sources of knowledge. But the fact that there are multiple sources of knowledge doesn't tell us about their comparative weights. And different groups of Muslims believe in weighing them differently. But when it comes to Orthodox Muslims, they give naql the priority over everything else. Islamic epistemology shapes pre-modern madrasa education. So pre-modern madrasas are structured around the notion that naql, aql, and ma'rifa are all key sources of knowledge, although since the madrasa is an orthodox institution, it gives naql a special focus. Okay, so let's consider the place of naql in pre-modern education. First of all, the major thing that they teach in pre-modern education is called al-ulum al-naqliya. Al-ulum al-naqliya. So these are knowledges, naql-based sources of knowledge, of which they include the Quran, Quran, tafsir, hadith, fiqh, and they also will teach the Arabic language. Generally speaking, when we're talking about naql, we're talking about acceptance of a text-centered tradition. So acceptance of Islamic scripture and not criticizing it, not have shak in it. Now, I'll go ahead and qualify that a little bit later on. But the idea is you're supposed to have iman. You're supposed to have iman in the Quran and hadith, even if some of it is amazing, even if some of it is very distant from what you would experience based on empirical knowledge. You should eliminate shak, and you should have iman. And this tradition is supposed to be uncritically accepted without change. You're not supposed to change it, you're supposed to accept. So this is reflected in ideas like taqleed, accepting what has been received, accepting interpretations of these scriptural texts that have been received, that have come down to you from more knowledgeable individuals in the past. And also a hostility towards bid'ah, to changing this tradition based on innovation. And this tradition is passed on through a number of different ways, which really center on uncritical acceptance without shak of various things. One of them is memorization of texts to precisely transmit the wording of scripture and other things. So you basically, there are memorization skills that are developed in the kutab. You develop them while you're memorizing the Quran, and then you use them to memorize other texts. Many of these texts come in the form of a matan, which is condensed. It's short in words, it's condensed in its rhyme to facilitate memorization. Memorization is not a process that involves critical thought. It's just an automatic reproduction of texts. Beyond that, people don't only receive the words of these texts that they are transmitting through memorization. There's also a commentary that the sheikh gives on these texts, because the sheikh will say, not only do you have to take from the past, take from past scholars, take from past ulama, take from past generations in an unbroken chain, not only do you have to take the wording, the precise wording of these texts, but you have to understand their precise meaning. And that's the point of commentary, of sharh. The point of giving a commentary is to make sure that in addition to the wording of these texts, you take the wording unchanged, you also take the meanings unchanged. So when you're sitting in a halaqah, in a masjid, traditionally the sheikh will read often a matan or some other text, and then offer a commentary to transmit and alter the meaning of these texts, or at least this is the ideal. Beyond this, there is the bodily imitation of exemplars. So the different teachers, the different sheikhs, the different ulama that are teaching in the madrasa, you imitate them. You imitate how they dress, you imitate how they pray. And one of the reasons why the madrasas are small in size is so that you can cultivate a personal relationship with a sheikh that extends beyond the madrasa. Ideally, if you're one of the top students, you become the companion, the sahib of the sheikh, and you engage in a process known as suhba. So suhba means that you don't just spend time with this sheikh in the context of the lessons, but you travel around with him. You're praying with him at the mosque. You're going over to his house to eat dinner. You're traveling around with him. Maybe you're washing his clothes, fixing his food as a type of khidmah. This is one of the things that is often part of the suhbah or the companionship relation. And the reason why you're doing this is you want to observe the sheikh continuously and imitate him. Because the idea is that his behavior, his prayer, his dress, his beard is all a reflection or a transmission of practices of a sunnah that comes from the Prophet ﷺ, has been transmitted in an unbroken chain from scholars, one generation after the other. And when we're talking about naql, this transmission of knowledge unchanged, there's very little emphasis on new research. So people don't say, oh, in order to become a good big scholar, you need to come up with some original idea, master's thesis, PhD thesis, where you produce something new that goes beyond the existing literature. There's not this idea. Aql in pre-modern education. Is there a place for aql in pre-modern education? Yes, but within limits. One of the reasons why we know this is the scholars in this era say that there are al-ulum al-aqliya, or forms of knowledge that are based on aql as opposed to naql. They include logic, certain parts of math, certain parts of philosophy like metaphysical aspects, especially when you're talking about proofs of God, cosmological argument, teleological argument, medicine. Also, more generally, students use their aql and they don't uncritically accept everything that they receive. So to give a couple examples, even in the field of hadith, which is very naql oriented, people criticize the chains. People criticize the hadith chains. They say, hey, you're claiming that this hadith comes from these individuals in an unbroken chain. Well, I know on the basis of aql that these two individuals never met each other. They lived in different parts of the world, and there's lots of evidence for this. So how could they transmit a hadith from one to another? Or there's lots of evidence that one had a bad memory or was a liar. So we can't simply accept that what he said was accurately transmitted from the Prophet ﷺ. You also have theological criticisms of anthropomorphism. It will say on the basis of aql, we know that God doesn't have a body, and therefore references to God having a body and the zahir of the nusus, the apparent meaning of the nusus, that God is literally located in a direction, in a jiha among the arsh, or he has a yad, or he has a wajh, or these other kind of things. Rationally, we know that God doesn't have these features, so we interpret them away. We're critical of the literal meaning of the text. I'm not saying that is a correct opinion. Obviously, the Ahlul Hadith don't have that opinion, but this is quite common among the Asharites, among the Maturidites. However, unlimited use of aql with no restrictions is something which is considered heretical and associated with the falasifa. You also have ma'rifa and pre-modern education in the sense that you have Sufi texts and ideas. These are taught in the madrasas, and historically the madrasa is linked to a Sufi tariqa and an initiation in such a tariqa. So this is a key part of the way that the madrasa is organized. Many of the scholars teaching are also members of the Sufi tariqa. The madrasa itself will be located next to different zawiyas or khanaqahs that teach Sufism, that are places where there is Sufi training going on. So this is why there is this link between the madrasa and the tariqa. Modern educational institutions are very different in these ways. So modern educational institutions are all influenced to some significant degree by post-Enlightenment liberal Western educational institutions. And this affects the underlying epistemology of Islamic education, and by extension, its characteristic pedagogy, which means the techniques of teaching, and also the institutional structure of Islamic education. And here there are three key changes. So one is de-emphasis of naql, one is de-emphasis of ma'rifa, and one is stronger emphasis on aql. These are the three shifts that we see. The Islamic madrasas are transformed so that they start prioritizing aql and they start de-emphasizing naql and ma'rifa. So how does this happen? The de-emphasis of naql is reflected in a rejection of uncritical acceptance of the past, uncritical acceptance of the past text-centered tradition. So this is reflected in a hostility towards taqlid. People are told you don't need to follow opinions from the past, make your own ijtihad. There's a rejection of a pedagogy which is tied to transmission of the tradition without changes. So they will say, learning is not just about memorizing texts and then passing them on. No, you need to be critical of what you're given. You don't just memorize it and pass it on. Or commentary is sterile. Rather than doing new research, you're simply taking what past people have written and you're just preserving the meanings. You're just commenting to preserve the meaning. That doesn't produce new knowledge. It's simply repeating and faithfully transmitting something from the past that's not acceptable. The notion of bodily imitation, that you're going to go ahead and follow your teacher around all the time in a suhbah relationship and bodily imitate him, so that you pass on unchanged the living sunnah that he exemplifies. No, this is also something that is rejected or marginalized. Also, there emerges a belief that if you want to be a scholar, if you want to be an alim, if you want to be a sheikh, it's not sufficient for you to simply teach what you have inherited from others. It's not sufficient for you to simply be a living exemplar from other students or for people in the community to imitate. No, what marks a scholar is not his ability to teach or to serve as an exemplar that is similar to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. What is the key feature of a scholar is the ability to produce new, unprecedented ideas through critical thinking and research. Bid'ah isn't a bad thing in a sense. Bid'ah is a good thing. They wouldn't say bid'ah. They would say like al-fikr al-ibda'i. Something along these lines.
Innovation.
Yeah. Innovation is something that is good. Innovation is not something that is bad. What makes a scholar the best scholar is the best innovator. So this is kind of a very different perspective. De-emphasis of ma'rifah. Ma'rifah is no longer a portal, a door to an appreciation of the existence of a deeper level of reality. It's a type of subjective hallucination that has nothing to do with knowledge whatsoever. It's a waste of time. Educational institutions are no longer linked to Sufi tariqas. They're no longer linked to an initiation process. And to be a scholar, it's no longer sufficient to acquire ma'rifah yourself and then train others to acquire the same ma'rifah. All of this is a waste of time. Why are you engaging in asceticism? Why are you learning how to move your body or how to breathe or how to chant? What does that have to do with producing a new article, a new thesis, a new dissertation? It's completely irrelevant. All of that should be expunged and expelled from the educational system. There's a stronger emphasis on aql. So aql is now the only truly valid source of knowledge. The aim of education is to help students develop their aql so that they can produce new knowledge through research. So what we're really talking about is an epistemic revolution that is embedded in the pedagogies and the subjects and the structure of the institutions. These institutions also are no longer small. The reason why you need a small madrasa in the past is you want to have personal relations between the students and the teachers so that the teachers can do sohbah with the students can mimic them. The teachers are also guiding them in like a Sufi kind of initiation. So why do we need a small madrasa anymore? We need to turn a university, Islamic education should be in a giant university which has 50,000 people, bureaucratically structured. There's no reason for personal relations. There's no reason for like a small institution to begin with. So this is really making the universe, making Islamic knowledge into large, impersonal, bureaucratic institutions really reflects an epistemic shift away from ma'rifah and imitation, naql type transmission of knowledge. Now, when we talk about modern Islamic educational institutions today, they come in three forms. The first is an Islam-related faculty, kuliya, or in certain cases, a department, a qism, which is part of a Western university, a secular Western university, usually established by the governments. When we talk about universities as opposed to madrasas, universities are giant institutions that require a lot of money. The only people with that money usually are government. So there's a lot more government involvement. So what are some examples of places where Islamic scholars are trained today? And they're trained in an Islam-related faculty, but at a Western-style institution. The classic example is Turkey. So Turkey has different universities. These universities are secular universities, but they have religious faculties, divinity faculties called ilahiyat faculties. The most famous ilahiyat faculty in Turkey is at Ankara University, although you can find other ilahiyat faculties at Istanbul University, at Marmara University, and so on. Another famous example of a faculty at an overall secular university is the Darul Uloom at Cairo University. Another example is the Sharia faculty at Damascus University. A more recent example of kind of a rising, propelled by petrodollars and lots of investment kind of university would be the College of Islamic Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University. Like it's good, it's a good Islamic Studies faculty, but it's part of a larger secular university. So that's model number one. You have an Islam-related faculty at a secular style, typical Western university. The second form that educational institutions take in the modern period is an Islamic university. What makes it an Islamic university? It has a mixture of religious and non-religious faculties, meaning kulliyas. So we'll have a kulliya of usul ad-din, where they will teach, let's say, Quran and Hadith and theology. They will have a kulliyat al-Sharia. They will have maybe a kulliyah lugha al-Arabiya. They will have these religious faculties, and then they'll also have some non-religious faculties. So they might have engineering, medicine, pharmacy, but even in these non-religious faculties, people still have to take some obligatory Islamic courses. So they have to memorize a certain amount of the Quran, they have to study Arabic, they have to take some basic classes on Islamic scripture or Islamic theology, even if they're studying to get a medical degree, or they're studying to get an engineering degree. People who graduate with degrees from these non-religious faculties like dentistry or even agriculture, once again, I'm not making this up. These are actually found at like Al-Azhar. The idea is that they're working in a secular field of knowledge, but they have like religious guidance. So one of the things that distinguishes the Islamic university model is it has lots of religious faculties that offer a wide range of religious classes, a range of religious classes that you wouldn't find at a secular university. And then the other thing that distinguishes an Islamic university is an Islamic moral environment. So there's a dress code, you're not allowed to have alcohol on campus, there's a level of sex segregation, and so on. What are examples of the Islamic university model? Al-Azhar University, Medina University, you could say al-Qura, or you could say Imam Muhammad ibn Saud, International Islamic University, Islamabad in Pakistan, Indonesian International Islamic University. So where I am, these are all based on the Islamic university model. And in coming episodes, we'll talk about how these are spread from region to region. The first, you might say, is like an Islamic institute. So these are smaller than universities. They're often linked to the authority of a particular sheikh. Oftentimes, they combine pre-universities and university-level studies. So you could have people who are over 18 studying there, but you could also have like a kind of high school level study as well. Some examples of this, you find this among Darul Ulooms, like Deobandi Darul Ulooms. You also find these among Indonesian pesantrens, some Indonesian pesantrens. So this actually, of all the different models, this is the closest to the pre-modern model, but there are still differences as well. Okay, so yeah, that kind of sums up the slides, and we have a little bit of time if you have questions.
Yeah, so I was wondering, the third type of Islamic institute that you listed, like the Darul Uloom model, would you not say that it's not really like a new system of education? It's something that kind of just follows the classical method of education, including its like pedagogic decorum, including the curriculum, including the kind of values and morals and ethics that are promoted. All of this kind of seems to mimic everything that existed classically, right? Would you really say like it's a kind of modern system of education?
I would say it's impacted to some extent. So if you talk about, so once again, we can talk more about this, and I should review my notes carefully. I certainly think it's the closest to pre-modern educational institution, but some of these Darul Ulooms are quite big. Like, yeah, they're smaller than the universities, but are they as small as pre-modern madrasas? The fact that my also understanding of many of the Darul Ulooms is they do have age grades. Like, they're carefully grading people like by age for the sake of efficiency. This is kind of a new thing. When you start talking about any kind of Western forms of knowledge. So is it really the case that no Darul Ulooms teach any kind of, so certainly there is a predominance of Islamic subjects, but are we really talking about a situation where there has not been introduced a certain amount of Western subjects as well, although much less than these other places? Those are some areas where I would say it is possible to detect some kind of Western influence on education, although I want to review my notes before speaking more definitively on such a matter.
So I mean, like I could tell you maybe perhaps like anecdotally, and maybe there could be more longitudinal studies on this. But what I'm wondering is that, for example, in South Africa, the Darul Ulooms that are there, and I mean, those are kind of offshoots or replications of Darul Ulooms that are found, in the Indian subcontinent and many other places in the world. So in terms of like the age grade, that does not exist at all. I know for sure that there's in one classroom you'll have like a 30-year-old and you'll have another person who's like 18 years old.
Yeah.
There might be like a certain minimum cap for like, obviously what level of education. Like you're not expected to teach usul al-fiqh to like a 12-year-old. I mean, I've seen that happen as well, but generally you wouldn't really have that because just like the level of understanding that's required to grasp a subject like that, so that's one aspect of it. In terms of the inclusion of any kind of, if we can call it non-religious subject. So if you look in the Indian subcontinent, or you look in South Africa, in Panama, in UK, Australia, Canada, in the US, all of the Darul Uloom that follow the Deoband seminary pattern, they usually will not have any of those subjects. If they do in Western countries, it's generally, so in South Africa, for example, they don't have it at all. But if they do in the Western world, it's generally because that's a governmental requirement. Like in Canada, it's a governmental requirement. You officially cannot operate a school unless you include some minimum level of Western education. And the other thing is that in the US, you might have like parents that might wonder what their kids are going to do in the future if they don't know sufficient level of English, if they don't know enough mathematics. So I do think, like, from a kind of perspective of using them as tools, some of those subjects could be introduced, not as kind of like Western education, but rather just means to communicate with people, with communities, with audiences, and so on and so forth. So
and even on the point of large institutions, right? Like you'll have, for example, Deoband, which is like the mother institute, so that naturally grew. But I would say 90 to 95% of its of the branches which it's a decentralized network, right? But they are very small, right? So I think like on all 3 points that you mentioned, I think that like our experience is that it is actually the other way
Yeah,
around.
I mean, I do want to agree with Dr. Arya on the fact that the institutions have grown, and that kind of one-on-one level of connection might not be there as much as it used to before, especially at the bigger institutions. So, like for example, in the Deoband Seminary itself, I believe they have over like 10,000 students studying there. Just the final year has like over 1,500, over 2,000 students itself. Like this, also, if you go in Bangladesh, you'll also find the same thing as well. You'll find just in the final year they have over 2,000 students. So there isn't that kind of one-on-one care, definitely. However, I'll just caveat that with one thing, which is basically that teachers will usually have like a slot within the day when anyone can come to their homes and they can communicate with the students. So any student that's interested in having kind of like office hours setting, or I mean, it's usually more intimate than that, in the sense that you share tea, or you share some kind of meal, or you're having kind
Well,
of a conversation.
well, let me ask you. Let me ask you something about that. So, one of the people who has written on these Darul Ulooms is Masuda Bano, who's a scholar at Oxford, and she has a recent article called "Madrasa Reforms in Islamic Modernism in Bangladesh." So, for instance, I was trying to upload this article. I am having difficulty doing that, but for instance, she says that according to the madrasas that are operating in Bangladesh, they have it divided into Ibtidiya, Dakhil, Alim, Fazil, and Kamil, and that all of these are tied to particular age grades, like grade 1 to 5, grade 6 to 12, grade 13 to 14, grade 15 to 16, and 17 to 18.
Yeah, so
and she.
This is where I would like to kind of critique maybe the Western research methodologies. So the type of quote unquote, if we can call them that, madrasas that she's referring to is actually I've addressed it in my thesis. It's basically, it was started by the British. It's not the traditional. In Bangladesh, you have two types of quote unquote madrasas. You have Aliya madrasas, which are government funded, which will also in their offices they'll have like the portrait of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, and then they do have a great system. They will incorporate they'll study on a desk, like on a chair and a desk, as you would have in a regular high school, and so on and so forth. But then you also have the Qawmi madrasas, which are the actual like offshoots of the Deoband seminaries. So they will usually have like seating on the ground, traditional clothing, heavy segregation between the genders, actually just separate institutions. They won't even have the same institution for males and females, and they have zero government funding. They kind of just are run by the public. So I think what she's referring, the stages that you mentioned, the Alim, Fazil, I think they have like Kamil. I'm not fully aware of all the terminologies that they use, but that system is actually, it was started in Calcutta by the British colonial administration. Those are known as the Aliya.
Okay, well, that is helpful to know. I mean, so for instance, are you saying that so for instance, in terms of English teaching, in terms of teaching in mathematics, in terms of teaching in physics and biology, this is not found at the Deobandi madrasas?
It's completely, I mean, for better or worse, it's completely removed. Like there's not a single trace of it. I haven't seen any trace of it.
There is in Deoband they do have a department for teaching English now, but it's under the banner of Da'wah. So it's under the Department of Da'wah, and it's not like mandatory for everybody. I actually I've been there, but it's more like for, let's say somebody wants to do Da'wah, so you're learning English for that purpose. It's not like something which is for everybody, and it's more recent. And they have other certain languages too, but Yeah, and also like in terms of the point of like larger institutions, like even because I've visited actually. So you, for example, the lower level classes, like you'll have more like you'll have a big class, but they'll divide it into smaller classes with multiple teachers, so you will still get like a small group, except for when you get to the higher classes. Then of course everybody kind of wants to benefit from the best sheikh al hadith or whatnot. And I would even ask the question, that is this something necessarily modern, right? Like you would even have pre-modern ulama sheikh al hadith, where you would have a big halaqa, because everybody wants to take from that sheikh al hadith, for example.
Yeah,
Well, what I would say,
yeah, I
when
believe it
you
was also
talk about
narrated from Ibn Mas'ud, and also like Imam Abu Hanifa himself, right? Some of the muhaddithun as well, that had like large gatherings of students.
when the scholars had my understanding is that when scholars had large gatherings of students in the past, that there's spatial ranking, like certain people are understood, they will say come forward, like that in the front ranks are the students who have the closest relationship to the sheikh, and they're expected to attend regularly, and they're given the seats that are closest to him. And in fact, one of the things that the sheikh is doing as a way of projecting his personal authority is basically giving ijazas to his closest students, but denying them to just people who, I mean, maybe could give ijaza for baraka or something, but in terms of like a serious ijaza, you're not giving them to just anyone who shows up at the halaqah. This is also a question that I have with respect to the Deobandi madrasas. Are you saying that in terms of the certification, there's no institutional certification, that in fact, someone who goes to Darul Uloom Deoband or Darul Uloom Karachi, that they're not getting a degree, that they just get ijazas from the different sheikhs who are there?
So there are two different things, and some of the other types of certifications have been incorporated more recently. So you have ijazas for the books that are studied. So for example, like Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Jami' al-Tirmidhi, the Shama'il. You'll get individual ijazas for each one of these.
Even for like tafsir, and even some for
yeah,
fiqh stuff as well.
and so on and so forth. And at the end, generally, you will get one shahada, like you will get one certificate. And this is, you can say this happened maybe in the last like 50 years, right? Not before that, where they'll give.
So my goal here, I'm not trying in any way to attack or
No,
undermine.
I understand. For sure.
I genuinely believe that it's the reason why I mean, I do believe that it is the most similar to pre-modern education, but I am always a little bit just trying to be careful about even looking at subtle things like how sheikh's authority is tied to giving ijazas and whatnot, and what implications that that might have. But I also, one of the reasons why I'm really happy to have this opportunity to speak with you is obviously you're insiders with a very deep level of knowledge. And one of the things that I hope that we can do is because we have an entire episode that's going to pretty much focus on South Asia, and I'm really looking forward to discussing and learning with and from you about some of these detailed issues as well.
Inshallah. So
Jazakumullah khairan. Thank you so much, Dr. Arya. Inshallah, I think with that we can conclude episode 2. And to the viewers, thank you very much. And inshallah, we'll be back with episode 3. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum.